So I want to tell you guys a little bit about history in this video today. So the topic for today is about the Gilded Age. It was an era that was famous for its very rich individuals, and these individuals were coined the robber barons of the 1800s. So you might have heard of these names, but they're people like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Vanderbilt. And these people, they made billions while the majority of Americans lived paycheck to paycheck and often in terrible conditions. And it's easy to see that as something from the past, but at the same time, it might be pretty easy to see it as history repeating itself, especially when you look at what's happening today, since you'll see that the same things are starting to happen again. Wealth inequality is rising to levels that we haven't seen in decades because it was extremely high during the Gilded Age, and then it dipped after the Great Depression for several decades, and then started rising again, somewhere between the 1980s or so, I believe. And in this case, it might feel like the rules are stacked against regular people, and let me explain this in a little bit more detail. Again, the Gilded Age was a time of explosive economic growth in America, especially after the Civil War. So think about it. The railroad system was growing, the steel industry was booming, and oil was becoming big business. But while a few people got exceedingly rich, I'm talking about owning entire industries, most of the people were actually barely scraping by. Workers were unsafe, working grueling jobs for barely enough money to survive, and there was a huge gap between the rich who lived like royalty and the poor who lived in cramped, dangerous conditions. If you were lucky enough to get a job, then you worked 12-hour days, maybe every single day a week, for some pennies. Today, we've got somewhat of a similar situation, not exactly, but for example, let's say look at the tech industry. Guys like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. These people are worth more money than some entire countries. And Bezos himself made more in a single day during the pandemic than many Americans would in their entire lifetime. Meanwhile, millions of workers are stuck in low-wage jobs, or they're struggling in industries like fast food, retail, or gig work where there's no job security, there's no benefits, and there's barely any protections. The cost of living also keeps going up, especially with housing, healthcare, and education, but wages aren't keeping up. And if you've looked back into history, you've seen that real wages really hasn't gone up for a very long time. So if you're working your butt off and still finding it hard to make ends meet, you're actually not alone. And this is a very common thing. Now, back in the Gilded Age, the government didn't help much. In fact, it often sided with the rich. Maybe that sounds familiar too. The government let corporations run wild, and labor laws were either weak or non existent. When workers tried to strike for better wages and conditions, the government then sent in troops or police to break up the protests. The rich had so much power that even the law didn't seem to apply to them. Big companies, especially tech giants and Wall Street firms, they still have a huge amount of influence on politics thanks to legalized corruption, things called lobbying, campaign donations, and even just the power that comes with money. The politicians making the decisions don't actually seem to have much interest in helping regular folk either. And if you might remember, back in the 2014, there was actually a fairly popularized study that basically showed that the average common person, common American's vote had literally almost 0% effect on policy. However, if you were rich or a big business, then whatever your vote was actually had a lot of impact on policy. So a little bit again back to the Gilded Age, workers had enough and they began to organize. So they formed unions, they protested, they pushed for changes, and it wasn't easy. There were riots and bloody clashes with police, like the Haymarket Riot and the Homestead Strike, but eventually it led to reforms like child labor laws, workplace safety regulations, and also the right to form unions. Today we're seeing something similar. People are waking up to the fact that the system isn't working for them. There are movements for a higher minimum wage, like the fight for the $15, and more people are joining unions in industries, like where Amazon and Starbucks operate, where workers are saying enough is enough. But just like in the Gilded Age, the response from those in power often isn't, great, good job, go ahead. So instead of supporting workers, politicians and companies, they tend to do things they can, everything they can, to try to avoid paying fair wages or providing decent benefits. Let's talk about the way the rich justify this growing inequality. Back in the day, wealthy industrialists would say, Well, if you're poor, it's your fault. It's survival of the fittest, that's the American dream, it's individualism. Everything, basically, you are the master of your own destiny, and but with that, you also take all responsibility and any of the fallback. And they believed in something called social Darwinism, which basically argued that rich people were rich simply because they were better or more capable, and those at the bottom, they just weren't cut out for success. Unfortunately, you'll still hear some of this logic today. People will say things like, well, if you simply just worked harder, you'd be able to afford things like healthcare and housing. But it's not that simple. In fact, for many people, no matter how hard they work, the system is rigged in favor of those with the most wealth and power. Another thing the rich did during the Gilded Age was try to ease their guilt by giving back a little bit via philanthropy. Guys like Carnegie donated huge sums of money to build libraries and fund schools, which sounds nice, but let's also not forget that their fortunes were built on the backs of workers who had nothing. Today, we see similar things happening. Some billionaires donate a lot of money to charity. One famous YouTuber, he's even known for being the most charitable person or charitable YouTuber, but it doesn't fix the underlying problem, where they still make more money in a single day than most people will ever see in a lifetime. With that being said, that's about all I have for this video. If you liked it, please hit the like button, subscribe, leave me a comment, and thank you for watching.